On this afternoon of October the 18th, we here upon the upper deck of the flagship Cincinnati open the celebration of the canalization of this Ohio River with its series of locks and dams from Pittsburgh to Cairo. I am going to have Mrs. Howard of the Howard Shipbuilding Company take this famous gavel made of the woods of the various boats that have plied this river, including the wood from the Robert E. Lee, and ring this old famous bell. Loud.
Hold up your gavel.
Hold up the gavel. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby officially open this waterway, this path before your door, which makes us all neighbors from Pittsburgh to Cairo.
That was Mrs. Loretta Maud Howard, wife of Jim Howard, beginning the great steamboat parade from Pittsburgh to Cairo, celebrating the completion of the Ohio River locks and dams in October 1929. Loretta was an integral part of the Howards, a family, a shipyard, and a museum. When James Howard tragically drowned on that cold, drizzly October day in 1876, the shipyard fell to his partner and younger brother, John Howard, and to his 36-year-old son, Edmonds J. Howard. Born in 1840, Ed was educated in the Jeffersonville Public Schools, finishing up at the Kentucky Military Institute in Frankfort, Kentucky. Ed's dad also made sure his son was proficient in all phases of steamboat design and in every department of the shipyard, from the wood yard to the launching ways. In 1863, Ed married a Jeffersonville girl, Laura Burke, daughter of Temperance Burke. Out of this marriage would come two sons, Clyde in 1868 and Jim in 1875. What Ed and his Uncle John didn't know that tragic day was that the shipyard's best days and most magnificent boats still lay ahead. 1878 was significant because the shipyard produced three of the largest, finest floating palaces ever to ply the Mississippi River. For Captain John Tobin, who James Howard had helped get reestablished after the Civil War, they built the J.M. White. Magnificent in every detail, it was the largest, most spectacular cotton packet ever to ply the Mississippi River. For Captain John W. Cannon, famous owner of the racer Robert E. Lee, they built the boat he named for himself, the John W. Cannon. With its passenger promenade extending all the way to the bow, Cannon built this boat to impress the cotton planters on Louisiana's upper coast with its opulence and comfort. The talents of the shipyard's carpenters and painters can clearly be seen in the details of the John W. Cannon's main cabin. 3.5-year-old Jim Howard's first steamboat trip was on the Ed Richardson. Built jointly by Captain Cannon and Tobin, the Richardson was a dandy. Captain Cannon invited the Howard family on the boat's first trip from Louisville to New Orleans. With its main cabin 250 feet long, 19 feet wide, and 13 feet high, gleaming white with gold trim, it was a sight that Jim could vividly remember 70 years later. "1878 was also important because it was the last year of the entrepreneurial captains, such as Captain Cannon and Tobin, being the shipyard's major customer. The days of the high freight rates were over. Due to the worn-out soil from overproduction and the boll weevil, the cotton crop wasn't what it used to be. So, seeking safety in numbers, the corporately owned packet line began. From 1880 until about 1905, when the packet trade died, Howard's built boats for all the major lines on all the major inland waterways. With their signature gold anchors suspended between the smokestacks, the anchor line boats were first class in every department. Over the span of 17 years, Howard's built a total of 13 boats for this historic line. For the St. Louis and Tennessee River Packet Company, they built 11 handsome stern wheelers. With names such as the Stacker Lee, the Bayless Lee, the Ora Lee, the Lee line had Howard's built 11 boats for them. In January 1900, the Courier-Journal reported that pilot Mike Kelly said the Peters Lee was the best all-around stern-wheel boat ever built, and he said Ed Howard has built some dandies. The Louisville and Evansville line, whose president was Louisville businessman W.C. Height, had 5 boats built during this time period. Howard built 5 boats for the Louisville and Cincinnati line, which was managed by Commodore Fred Laidley. Laidley fell in love with the river when he made his first river trip on the Howard-built Diana in 1860. And they built 6 ferries for the Wigan Ferry Company in St. Louis, Missouri. They didn't just build packets during this time. For the Corps of Engineers, they built the 3 largest suction dredges ever on the river. They built the Louisville Life Saving Station, and they built the floating Louisville Boat Club. In 1898, they shipped 3 trainloads of prefabricated parts and 125 shipyard workers to Alaska, where they built 3 passenger boats and a towboat for use on the Yukon River. They prefabricated boats and barges which were shipped south in pieces for use on the rivers in South and Central America. In 1900, a person could ride a Howard-built boat on all the major rivers from the Yukon in Alaska to the Orinoco River in South America. Most of this growth was Ed's doing because early on, in 1884, he bought out his uncle's interest in the shipyard, and the business became Ed's alone. John may have left the shipyard business, but he did not retire. He and a group of 4 other local businessmen bought French Lick Springs. With his son, Dr. John Howard Jr., as medical director, John managed the resort spa until he sold it in 1901. The shipyard under Ed was a good place to work, as evidenced by the years of service of many of their employees. Men working there 35-40 years was not unusual, with several retiring with over 50 years of service. The workers felt pride in accomplishments, for they would start with logs floated down the river and transform them in just a few short months into a beautiful boat using nothing but their skills and talent. Ed was not just a boat builder. He was also a very important member of the community. He was on the board of 2 banks, a city councilman, a vestryman for his church, and he built and gave to the city a new firehouse for Port Fulton. Ed and Laura began work on their house, which now houses a museum, in 1890. This was actually the 3rd Howard house. The first was built by Ed's father, shipyard founder James, in 1848, just after he established the shipyard in Jeffersonville. This house was torn down in 1890, and Ed built a new shipyard office on its location. The second house was located across Market Street from the shipyard. It was built by James in 1856. This house stood until the early 1980s, when Jeff Boat tore it down to make room for a parking lot. While work was underway on the mansion, Ed was commissioned to head the Inland Waterways exhibit for the Chicago Columbian Exposition in 1893. The exhibit was housed in the Indiana State Pavilion. While at the fair, Laura bought beds, chandeliers, and other items for her new house. After 4 years of planning and building, Ed, Laura, their 2 sons, Jim and Clyde's wife, Julia, moved in. In 1901, Ed bought one of the first automobiles in Jeffersonville. They enjoyed river trips on their pleasure boat, the Frolic, and they enjoyed a good game of euchre with friends and relatives in the evenings. Laura put the Moorish music room to good use by having students from the local dance school put on performances. They vacationed with their grandchildren in Ormond Beach, Florida. And they were typical grandparents enjoying their 6 grandchildren. In the 1890s, Ed began buying up competing shipyards to assure that if someone wanted a new boat built, they would have to come to Jeffersonville. He bought the Queen City Marine Railway in Cincinnati, the Madison Shipyard in Madison, Indiana, the Paducah and the Mound City, Illinois Marine Ways. If a boat owner needed a boat repaired or built anywhere from Ashland, Kentucky to Memphis, Tennessee, they would have to use a Howard shipyard. Business was good during the first decade of the 20th century, but times were changing. The packet lines, which for the past 25 years had been the shipyard's bread and butter, began to fail one by one. After 1910, the shipyard only built a few traditional packets. Also, wood hulls were giving way to steel hulls. In 1897, Ed had put in a steel plate shop because wood was becoming hard to get and very expensive. Towboat and barge production began to help offset the decline in packet boat building. It was during this time that Loretta Wooden first met Jim Howard, when Jim and a friend came to hunt on the Wooden's farm in Republican, Indiana, which is just north of Madison. 20-year-old Loretta was immediately attracted to Jim. She said he was like a long, tall drink of water. Jim, who was 10 years older than Loretta, always looking for new lines of business. Among his other duties at the shipyard, he started a racing boat division, building some of the fastest speedboats on the river. His boat, the Little Captain, won the Louisville Racing Championship several years in a row. Jim, visiting Columbus, Indiana, noticed there was no roller skating rink in the town. Roller skating was quite the rage in 1907. Seeing a business opportunity, he brought the idea up to his fiancée, Loretta. She jumped at the chance, saying she would manage it on a full-time basis. They rented a piece of property, got a bank loan, and built the Columbian Rink. Loretta moved into Mrs. Prather's rooming house. Jim would come up from Jeffersonville on the weekends. As he later said, if the crowds had been good that week, I'd treat myself to the $1 deluxe room. If not, it was a 75-cent standard room. Jim and Loretta were married on June 23, 1908 in Columbus, Indiana. They bought a house and started their married life, which would continue for the next 48 years until Jim's death. After 2.5 years in Columbus, Jim's duties at the shipyard required his full-time presence, so they dismantled the skating rink and moved to Jeffersonville, into the 1856 house, where they started a family. Jim and Loretta's marriage would produce 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. With Jim overseeing production and Clyde running the office, the next few years were good. During this time, they built the stern wheel packet Peoria, which made several annual trips from St. Louis to the Mardi Gras in New Orleans. They also built the very popular excursion steamer Homer Smith. In 1915, the yard signed a contract to build an all-steel, diesel-powered, self-loading and unloading freight boat. Nothing like it had ever been seen on the rivers before. The contract contained severe penalties for late delivery. Trouble began almost before the first sheet of steel was laid. There were conflicts between the Howard engineers and the boat designers. All of this caused delays, the result of which was the boat was several months late in delivery. The company promptly filed suit and withheld the final payment. With a large lawsuit hanging over it, and a lack of business due to the country's entrance into World War I and resultant transportation system disruption, the shipyard was almost bankrupt. In fact, there was talk of selling the family business. On top of all this, Ed's health began to fail. Edmonds J. Howard died of a massive stroke in January 1919. His wife Laura would follow him 9 months later in September of that same year. Soon after his dad's death, Clyde went to Washington, where he was able to secure a $400,000 contract from the government for 3 propeller-driven steam towboats to be used on the Warrior River. In order to raise capital to begin this contract, the Howards had to sell their shipyards in Cincinnati, Paducah, and Mound City. By 1920, with the lawsuit settled and the final payment received and the money from the government contract, the shipyard was on firm financial footing, and Jim and Clyde prospered, building barges, ferries, towboats, and other vessels. The shipyard's payroll grew from when they inherited from their dad for just 3 watchmen to 125 employees. The last packet boat, which had been the yard's bread and butter for the past 90 years, was built in 1923, the Cape Girardeau. Shortly after the completion of the Cape Girardeau, Clyde and Jim had a parting of the ways, with Jim buying out Clyde's interest in the Jeffersonville yard. Clyde retained management of the shipyard in Madison, and he soon repurchased the yard in Mound City, Illinois. He would run these shipyards until his death in 1942. Jim's wife, Loretta, assumed Clyde's old position as secretary-treasurer of the company. Loretta soon became quite an influence in river affairs. She became quite active in the Ohio Valley Improvement Association to get locks and dams on the Ohio River completed. Prior to 1929, the Ohio would suffer periods of low water when practically all navigation would come to a halt. With a series of 49 locks and dams along its 981-mile length, the Ohio River had a guaranteed year-round depth of 9 feet. Jim Howard early on realized that in order to fit through the locks efficiently, standardization of both towboats and barges was necessary. So Jim designed and built what he had hoped would become the standard Ohio River towboat. Launched in October 1929, this was the first boat in Howard's long history to be built without a specific customer or contract. Just a couple of weeks after the launch of Jim's towboat came the famous stock market crash in October of 1929. All credit dried up, and the boat, which he named after his wife, the Loretta Howard, remained unsold for over 2 years. The creditors foreclosed on the shipyard. Jim promised if allowed to keep the yard, he would pay back every penny he owed. With a slight upturn in business in 1931, when they built the last steam-powered boat the yard would ever produce, the towboat Mark Twain, Jim was able to fulfill his promise.